Welcome, everybody, to the next panel for Digital and Global Equiano. This is a roundtable that considers the digital presences and uses of Equiano today. Kaushik Tekur is a PhD candidate at the Department of English, Binghamton University at SUNY. This academic year, he's a visiting assistant professor at Ashoka University, and he's speaking there to us there today in India. He's teaching courses on the 18th century, translation, human rights, and digital humanities. His interest relies in studying the interactions of the long 18th century, its literary forms, and the British Empire's evolving policing and surveilling practices globally. His recent work has appeared in Literature and Film Quarterly, 18th Century Fiction, where there's an excellent essay on abolition, on policing in Equiano, Keats Shelley Review, and the LA Review of Books. Dr. Sebastian Franklin is a reader in Literature, Media and Theory at King's College London. His scholarship encompasses media theory and history, Marxism, critical work on race and racialization, the history of science and contemporary art and literature. Broadly, Seb is interested in the ways in which social forms, cultural practices, and systems of knowledge shape and are shaped by media technologies. More specifically, he closely reads archival and published materials from the histories of science and technology, critical theory, and literature. And he's the author of two monographs, The Digitally Disposed and Racial Capitalism and the Informatics of Value, both of which I think will be very important for this conversation. Rowan Melling copes with the massive horror of digital modernity through painting and academic research. His work explores the relationship of power, media, and subjectivity, and its goal is to clear a path to something less bad than the status quo. He has an MA in German Studies and is currently undertaking a PhD in Communications at Simon Fraser University. His paintings have been shown at the Tech Gallery and CSI Space in Vancouver, and his writing is published in the Capacious Journal and the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies. And certainly that multimedia aspect of Rowan's work is very important to Equiano and the Black Atlantic. Zach Wagner is a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature at Binghamton University. His research focuses from the perspective of philosophies of difference on new subject formations and emerging from the entangled history of information theory and neo-imperialism, really vital study for where we are. Shruti Jain is a PhD candidate at SUNY Binghamton. Her dissertation focuses on the networks of caste and race in the global 18th century, so very important. She's also the co-host and co-producer of the podcast Immigrants Wake America, which helps her to explore the role that podcasts play in digital archiving in the 18th century and beyond. Welcome to all of you for this roundtable. I often think that there's something of Zoom that can also recapture the old days of radio, where we talk and listen to each other. So maybe we can think about that. Now, I just want to introduce this seminar and the questions that will be being discussed. It will be helpful for us thinking in terms of scholarship, reading, but also possibly in your classrooms. Digital Equiano is a reading seminar, and you'll be given materials on our Global Equiano webpage that will also accompany this seminar. And it approaches the question of the global and Equiano through the digital that has been influencing our reading and interpretive practices so profoundly. Focusing on recent digital engagements with Equiano, such as Equiano Stories on TikTok and Equiano's World, this seminar will ask how Equiano helps us to see the digital differently and vice versa. Questions of identity, global travel, freedom, and narrative forms continue to be of significance digitally, as they are in slave narratives. And I might interject and say, of course, Equiano and the Sons of Africa knew they had to be multimedia in the 18th century in their abolitionist practices, using petitions, letters, narratives, the oral tours, the speaking tours, and visual arts. Seb Franklin, among others, has shown us this genealogy and how the promises of digital culture remain relationally bound to Atlantic slavery and its afterlives. Really insightful and profound point there. In the context of this digital culture, the seminar thinks with Equiano, whose engagement with Atlantic slavery has always received enormous scholarly attention. His critical and ironic engagement with the atomistic individual and the liberalism that its genres center offers us creative ways to engage with the enclosures of digital subjectivity, which in itself is predicated always on anti-Blackness. And I think that's crucial to bear in mind. Further, his fashioning of freedom alongside the constraints of narrative and socio-economic forces presents us with methods to think fugitively within exclusive and exploitative categories such as value and human. Drawing from scholarship in critical digital studies and critical race studies, this seminar will discuss the intertwined relationships among Blackness and the digital, with Equiano as a fulcrum for the conversation. We're cognizant of Catherine Steele's criticism that books about race are often about Black men, and books about technology are often about white men, and books about feminism are often about white women. So this seminar will also bring into question the very focus that we have on that today. Have digital engagements with Equiano opened up the space to differently imagine the role that Black women played in his life and period? And the seminar ultimately asks, following Simone Brown, how Black archives reframe questions of digitality. So thank you for these deeply profound questions and really important questions, and questions of race and gender and subjectivity in the digital sphere. I'm going to hand it over now to Kaushik, who will internally moderate the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kerry. Thank you and everyone else for putting this conference together. I think it's made it possible for so many of us in different countries at this point. I think in the roundtable, we have people 3 or 4 countries be a part of this in different time zones and for making it virtual and free. So I really appreciate all the conference organizers for doing that and having us put this seminar together. All of us have been thinking about this in different directions. So it's been really great to meet some people that I've, like Seb, I'm meeting for the first time. Rowan, I've met once before. So it's been great for us to think together. And we've been working on this for like a month or two. So it's been great. So thank you for that opportunity for us to think together. So what we're doing today is we have put together a set of questions based on what we want to think around this broad topic. And each of us came up with a couple of questions. And instead of making a small presentation, each of us will try and respond to the questions. So it'll be more conversational. And I thought it'd be a good place to start with maybe Shruti, your question about globality and the digital. So if you want to talk a little bit about why you put this question together, what your thoughts were, and give us some directions in which we can all talk to you about it, maybe it'd be great.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. This question draws directly from the description of our panel, which is great because that's what we've been kind of rehearsing so far in this session. We start by thinking about how Equiano helps us see the world differently and those kinds of things. And Kerry also mentioned that he knew, even in the 18th century, that he had to be multimedia to do the things that he wanted to do, right? So this question directly asks how the digital today helps us further expand a sense of globality when reading Equiano in this already global context. Basically trying to begin thinking about this panel as how the global and digital work together. I am particularly also thinking about classrooms and global classrooms everywhere in the world. We're trying to teach Equiano. We're trying to teach the 18th, 19th century and race making and those kinds of things, and what the digital does in helping us teach these things. So for my students, I've noticed that they like to watch things like Bridgerton or Instagram Equiano stories. And a lot of us often have a snobbish attitude towards those things for right reasons, maybe or not, I don't know. But it is still useful because they are looking at these stories from a few centuries ago on their phones or on their laptops. So the medium itself helps them feel a little bit more connected to things that they otherwise would probably feel more distant from, right? But also I'm thinking here about how the self-fashioning that we see Equiano do in the text, in the book or the slave narrative, and how that gets altered in the digital world helps us once again ponder over or consider the lasting impact, importance, and presence of Equiano amidst us in the digital world today. So the things that he raises are with us right now. Yeah, so that's where that thinking is coming from. Yeah, and I should also say that, Kaushik, you're going to be teaching Equiano in India, right? Or at least the 18th century. I don't know if you're teaching Equiano. So I don't know if you want to speak to what a classroom like that would do to this question.
Right, right. I definitely want to talk about that. But before that, I also was immediately thinking of Seb, you talking about some of this stuff pretty much like in the very first chapter of your second book, Digitally Disposed, because we were talking a lot about the Google cable that's called Equiano, and I know you talk about it in interesting ways, and it was Zach who introduced me to your work. And what that made me think about was in terms of the digital circulation of some of these things, there's a forced nature in which this migration and circulation that happens, which sadly, I think replicates some of the forced migration of enslaved peoples themselves. So even as we think of the global meanderings of Equiano, it's sort of helpful to keep the material conditions under which Equiano was forced to take this global meanderings upon himself, and which still continues to structure the current globalized world, where the global has a lot of components that's really forced upon people and migrations of different kinds. And Equiano always being under the threat of being sent away from one place to another, even though he earned his freedom, there was always this looming threat that he could be enslaved again and sent off to another place, not very much under his own control. So that kind of migration, sadly, like I said, parallels a lot of circulation of Black trauma, I think, on digital spaces. And where some of this stuff has also ended up is pretty sad with how Equiano is being appropriated, like Kerry was talking earlier, by right-wing projects. And this one itself that Zach and I talk about, Equiano Stories, is being produced by an Israeli filmmaker. And they've been trying to club it along with Holocaust narratives as well. And if you go and check, and Zach and I talk about this a little bit, when you go and try to follow the Equiano Stories page, it immediately leads you to a lot of Zionist handles on Instagram, despite the long-standing tradition of Black thinkers fighting both anti-Semitism and Israeli apartheid state on the other hand. So there are these ways in which Equiano perhaps was not comfortable with that he was being circulated, his text was being circulated back then, and he was forcefully migrated back then, and how his narrative on the digital space is currently being circulated in very uncomfortable proximities with certain things like the Israeli project itself. So I thought maybe Seb, you could talk a little bit about the material conditions of how some of these things are working digitally too.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that. Yeah, so for anyone that's not familiar with Google's cable, in 2019, Google announced a new subsea cable, internet cable project to run from Portugal to South Africa, with the first kind of bridging point in Nigeria. So it's literally retracing one of the earliest vectors of the transatlantic slave trade, at least one side of the triangle. And so at the very beginning of this book, The Digitally Disposed, I wrote a little bit about how the promotional materials for the cable direct us towards some maybe kind of submerged confluences of capital accumulation, liberal personhood, or maybe subjected in general, and racial slavery. So there's an extraordinary paragraph in the promotional material. I mean, it's a single sentence, in fact, that shifts from an extremely compressed biography of Equiano that emphasizes his abolitionism and his writing, and barely mentions enslavement at all, or the significance of the slave, and then immediately moves in the second clause of the sentence to describing the capacity of the cable. so that the carrier capacity of the table. And so there's this very literal conjoining of liberal personhood, the opposite of slavery, and enhanced or intensified communicational capacity via a technical infrastructure. And so in that example, both the existence of the cable and the kind of close reading of the materials that were circulated to announce it, it very helpfully kind of mapped out the subject of that book, which is interesting because when I started working on that book, which is about value, the digital and racialization, I wasn't aware of the Equiano cable, which wasn't announced until 2019. So it's one of those instances where a perfect kind of framing example for the beginning of your introduction appears after you've written the whole thing. But on the question of digitality and the global and how we might kind of run those questions through Equiano, I think our answer might depend on how we want to define the digital. So if by digital we mean electronic digital computing machines, we might arrive at one set of answers to do with a relationship between computer networks and the global dispersion, say, of production or the global circulation of labor. And this is the kind of answer we might find in someone like Manuel Castells or Michael Hart and Antonio Negri. But if by digital we mean something broader, and something with a much longer history, something like discrete abstractions that can be combined into some kind of operative system, we arrive at different, and in my view, more interesting answers. So from that perspective, language is digital, and so is money, so the form of appearance of value, and thus the basic medium of the capitalist form of society. And since Atlantic slavery centered on a particular synthesis of the commodity form with racial blackness, we might then observe that the racialized slave is the outcome of digital operations in a globalizing network of production and circulation that we can trace to the 15th century. And so too is the subject, or the modern self-possessed legal person, the free bearer of labor power for sale. So there's a question of what we mean by digital, which I think is really important here as well. There's the narrow sense of digital technology, which will be central to how we might want to think about something like Equiano stories as a mediation of Equiano's narrative. But I think there's a broader and also maybe more technical definition of the digital that allows us to think more capaciously about these longer historical trajectories of capital accumulation, the assignment of differential status, free and enslaved, via different relationships to the commodity, and thus the history of racial blackness. Those are the things that jumped out when I started thinking about actually all of these questions, and hopefully having those in circulation will be useful in this conversation too.
I could add on to that if that's cool, because I think that's it's really interesting to think of the digital in that broad sense. And I guess like one way I might think about it is through kind of the theory of cultural techniques, which Bernard Ziegert defines as kind of methods for processing kind of digital or binary distinctions. So in this case, we might think about like the free slave dichotomy and like what kinds of techniques are at play to authenticate bodies as one or the other. And something that's really interesting in the novel, I find, is that like in some way, or it's partially an epistolary novel, like there's all these pieces of paper kind of circulating around, and like the ultimate piece of paper is this letter from Equiano's old master that says, "I've set this person free." So in a way, this is like a technique to try to attach a certain, or to process this digital distinction between free and slave on the free side of that binary. But like it doesn't really work all the time. Like he isn't really able to, like there's other forms of mediation, other forms of processing in play. And like you were saying, Kaushik, that he's kind of constantly under threat of being recaptured. And I think something that's interesting about like internet, like circulation of information is this kind of early promise of the internet that actually you can be fully in charge of what information gets attached to your body. Like you get to process those distinctions via these techniques available online. This is like the promise of the Declaration of the Rights of Cyberspace. Is that John Perry Barlow, I think? I could be wrong about that. And of course, this doesn't quite pan out, like as we all know. There's still kind of racist algorithms, kind of like the siloing of information in kind of like highly specified identity categories and this kind of thing. So obviously it's not the same, but I think there's an interesting resonance there with its like these promises both in the novel and today of like this piece of paper or this Instagram page or whatever will allow you to kind of process these distinctions yourself and not have external techniques interfere with that much. And I feel like that's kind of still in struggle despite its disavowal.
Yeah, I was also thinking of the cultural techniques with this question in general. Like I almost flipped it on its head and said the digital allows us to think of how we got to the digital. And I revisited the Ziegert, inspired by the essay of the self-made slave. I went back and revisited the chapter on the water lines and the boat. And one thing I think about, like with this general definition of information too, is in order to have communication, the need to in a maybe Sarsian sense interrupt, to like block off, to have the clear channel in its time, and then the exclusion of what's blocked off in a certain way. So like the insulation on a printed circuit board or something like that is what I'm thinking about. And what I find really interesting in Ziegert's account of gridding the ocean, of striating the smooth space, of discretizing it in order to know where people are or are not. He doesn't really give an account of the hold because he's talking about, colonial technologies. Like, so I was thinking about Christina Sharp and the hold, and like these ships would have also had a space of like a storage kind of technology for slaves. And it's interesting that is the like kind of excluded interruption that allows for the clear channel of that book to work as it does. And it makes an excellent case. But like, so one of the things I want to think about too through this whole thing is how like Blackness in general kind of sometimes functions like this. Like even in works like Moten, like his kind of virtual Blackness sometimes falls in line with information theory in a certain way. That I would also, if it comes up, I would like to like think about too through this.
And in terms of thinking about Blackness and the role it plays, the other question I had on the document was thinking about what are certain things about Equiano's narrative and how Henry Louis Gates helps us see it, his way of engaging in an ironic play, staying at a distance with the author function, which is starting to become so crucial when he's writing the slave narrative, to liberalism itself. And because you invoke Moten, I'm thinking, what are some improvisational ways in which Equiano engages with this really violent system that he's being forced to be a part of, and trying to fashion some kind of agency without falling into the trap of a liberal individual? So what are some ways in which Equiano creatively engages with this kind of an atmosphere that seem relevant for us to take up in the context of a digital world where, like Rowan said, we're perhaps still like in early stages and very, very, very fastly moving towards a direction where it could get harder. So what are the affordances of still engaging with Equiano's own improvisational play with the structures and forces that he was dealing with? That was one of the questions I had. And I know I didn't respond to Shruti's earlier question about the circulation of text and what it means to teach Equiano in India. So I just briefly want to say that it's interesting to be teaching Equiano in India. I'm teaching Equiano in my human rights class, and I'm thinking about caste in another class, and caste in itself becomes this way through for people to engage with transatlantic slavery as well. A lot of anti-caste thinkers trying to draw parallels with the experience of the enslaved people. And my students have a better sense of anti-caste thinkers thinking about slavery as a metaphor. So it's very different when I've taught this before. I've taught Equiano in Binghamton, so where the American students, largely American students, come with a sense of a cultural memory of transatlantic slave trade, whereas to the Indian students that I'm going to be teaching it to, they have a sense of it, but it does not quite translate in the same ways into their cultural memories as well. But that's all I wanted to say about that question, Shruti.
Yeah, no, that's great. I was also thinking about when Kathy Luby talks about teaching 18th century and race. One of the things that she ends by saying is that her students often wish that they were taught this in their high schools, and history lessons. They wish their history lessons would have been different, which is really different when you take Equiano to India. That's not like a comment that will necessarily arise as frequently as it does in the classrooms in the US, right? And I just also want to briefly say that there is so much work currently being done about the metaphorization of slavery in general around the world, and the pitfalls of something like that, something that does not account for the particularities of chattel slavery. But then there's also work on specifically the connections between race and caste, Wilkerson making that conversation kind of blow up in certain ways. And while there is the big thing of building global solidarities that becomes possible through the literary device of metaphors, so to speak, there's also the particularities again of caste and of slavery that need to always be kept in mind when teaching in those classrooms. And even in the 18th century, when Equiano is writing, this is getting more into my dissertation stuff, but like thinkers of this period of the Enlightenment are aware of the system of caste in certain ways and are trying to appropriate it and think about difference, and specifically racial difference, in a lot of casted terms. But yeah, we can come back to the question on gates, and maybe also expand what you were saying to think in the same line of conversation about how Gates says that it's hard to arrive at a consensus of signifying. And when we read Equiano through Gates in that manner in a classroom, I feel like Equiano also then pushes us to rethink our classroom models of interpretation, or arriving at an interpretation of a text, or at best multiple interpretations of a text, and how Equiano forces us to sit with the lack of consensus in the process of signifying itself, especially when reading with Gates.
Just very quickly on the question of what seems to be a kind of general compulsion to metaphorize slavery, or to generalize slavery across the specifically Atlantic form and multiple other quite different forms. I've been working on a project for the last year or so called Mechanical Slavery, which is specifically on slave metaphors in automation debates in the mid-20th century, and there you see this extraordinary compression of those different kind of metaphorized slaveries. Often you find a kind of generalized Athenian slavery very quickly turning into the kind of rhetorical slavery that we find in Marx, the wage slave, but then very quickly kind of touching on and then jumping back out of specifically Atlantic chattel slavery. And so there's this really interesting thing happening where the presence of automation, which of course is very often defined as the application of electronic digital computing to industrial and other processes, the presence of automation kind of compels this kind of vomiting up of all of the vectors of slavery metaphorization that have been building up since I think the 18th century at least, if not earlier. And to come back to the question of cultural techniques, I think that there are, some kind of troubling political constraints in the kind of primary literature on cultural techniques. But I think that methods, as it's developed in German media theory, has a lot of promise as a way of working through and disaggregating distinct orders of subjection. So thinking through the specificity of, say, Atlantic chattel slavery as a dense network of legal, economic, psychic, and other kind of structurally bound elements. So I'm glad that approach, as many disagreements as I have with it on certain grounds, I'm glad that approach is in circulation, because it's quite useful for thinking through some of these otherwise problematically encrypted concepts, in particular the distinction between freedom and subjection, or freedom and slavery.
I was thinking also about how in our project, Zach and I think about the different ways in which Instagram in itself, like its features, lets you account for certain lines of light. And I thought maybe Zach, you could speak to that a little bit in terms of like the stories feature itself that Insta Stories uses, so like the mosaic model and things like that.
Yeah. Looking back on the sections that I wrote now, I mean, we always do this as writers, where we go back and be like, I don't know about how I did that. And one of the things that I noticed that I was doing was, in my attempts to so thoroughly push away like somebody kind of taking up Equiano's image to do a more propaganda driven thing, I was too focused on running away from like the phantasmatic being of Equiano, right? I wanted to keep like denying or disavowing that phantom, which is important, but like instead trying to find a balance of like what then is this performance that's being like produced, and who can actually take it up in a certain way earnestly. And I think this also comes back in a more like grounded media sense, like what can actually be done on Instagram. I'm thinking about the article we read, The Ragged Manifold of the Self, and how it talks about the YouTube algorithms kind of narrowing down into almost this like kind of metastable like system of possibilities, rather than like an endless series of possibilities of what will actually be like become available and presented. And so one of our biggest kind of like critiques of this project was that it's very like explanatory, from almost like a colonial gaze in a certain way. It constantly presents this like anthropological like explanation of Igbo people, rather than it like in a certain sense trying to escape that, like the lines of flight. But one area that we thought maybe like when we were trying to think of what this could do would be the way that stories would break up. They're very regimented, unlike cinema, where there's like you can make the edit cut wherever you want. Like stories have a time limit, and then it cuts to the next one, and there's usually like a brief little break there. So I think we talk about like in that break the screen goes black and you see yourself in the black screen, and not in the like the turned off screen, and just how you can play with the old models of cinema there, like the different editing that can be done there, how the gap between each one can also be something. So I guess we were just trying to brainstorm how this platform could still kind of, despite its algorithmic enclosings, maybe still produce something new, something that escapes the white gaze in a certain way.
Yeah, that was one of the places where I was thinking that you can still hold on to something that the author function Equiano offers when you move to the digital platform. So even if you don't want to do a very typical, oh, the movie is not like the book kind of thing, you can still hold on to certain things. And one of those things was just how difficult it was, I think, for Equiano to have to deal with a lot of these narrative situations, apart from the real world situations, not that narrative isn't real world. And something from there that always continues to be a part of all conversation is the talking book episode, right? And there's this way in which he defamiliarizes the medium through which he's narrating itself. So in the slave narrative, he talks about the book that he thinks actually will speak back to you. And I was thinking that that sort of defamiliarization doesn't really happen in the Instagram adaptation of Equiano as Equiano stories. It just and that's when, Rowan, I was thinking of your question, I think, which is what does it mean to have that kind of a tagline, where I think it says something like, what does it look like for an African boy in the 18th century to have access to smartphone or something like that, where it normalizes the sense of having access to certain media and certain narratives, narrative techniques. Whereas I would imagine, if you were to do a creative project, I would imagine Equiano trying to defamiliarize that process as well. But I don't know if that's what you were thinking about in terms of the grounding of the particular kind of authorship that Equiano Stories creates.
Yeah, yeah, in some ways. But something, yeah, I feel like there's some interesting tensions playing out, like just starting with that Goria Nova article you just mentioned, Zach, the ragged manifold. Um, Something that's I find interesting about it, I feel like she too quickly goes with the kind of machinic author. Like she basically she says, you know, there's elements on, I mean, she's talking about YouTube, but I feel like there's you can extrapolate a little bit. There's elements of these kind of profile-based platforms that recall kind of uh, the techniques of authorship and producing subjective interiority and individuality from 1800, and she's calling on Kittler's formulation of that. And then there's also aspects that recall these more desubjectifying media of 1900 that kind of start registering the body and its kind of the ways it's in excess of subjective control. And ultimately she comes down on the side of the latter, so that you know, there's these techniques for producing interiority and subjectivity, but ultimately we're all just kind of doing the same frenetic gestures on these platforms. And one funny kind of example of that, I don't know if you guys are familiar with this Insta Repeat account, which is kind of an Instagram example where this person kind of collates basically fully identical images. Like it'll all be like the same waterfall with someone holding out like the same wristwatch in front of it. And this person has found these totally independently produced by various Instagram users. So I guess all that to say, I feel like what's interesting here is this tension in which I think already the author on Instagram is a question, and more so, I feel like this is now kind of has become a general anxiety, particularly following like that film, The Social Dilemma, that was seemed to create a lot of fear about kind of, am I really me, or am I being fully manipulated online? But at the same time, I feel like this Equiano Stories really comes down on the side of this medium kind of producing an authorial subject. And something that I found very interesting about you guys' article that you pointed out is actually the narrative stops before this kind of the part of the book in which he is becoming and troubling an authorial subject through acquiring writing and other skills. So I find that quite interesting, that like the Instagram account suggests that's actually not necessary. You know, like if he'd had Instagram, he wouldn't have had to learn all that stuff, and he could have just kind of you know, been mediating himself all along, and we don't really need the rest of the narrative or whatever. And I mean, I yeah, I wonder like what you guys think of what kind of author that is. Like I guess I might say it's a more romantic, like romanticist author. So one that kind of already has access through a kind of inner genius or something to the ability to self-mediate in precisely the way you want, rather than being constrained by um, circumstances and language and media and stuff. Yeah.
I'm so just to clarify, are you asking about the original text or like Equiano stories? Which kind of authorship? Sorry.
More the stories, but
Yeah.
I'm interested in both. Yeah. Or a comparison, I guess,
Well,
with
and
the
what's
different authors.
especially strange too is the way that the narrative would keep wresting his perspective away from him too. So not only do you not have like this like the predator, like the genius, born genius author with an internal thought, you have like exposition being given by a camera that is supposed to be him in control of that, and yet like in a spectral way, like taken from him. Like I think we talk about the scene where it shifts from him explicitly doing selfies to a scene where like the camera is set up in a third person perspective, but who is that third, who's filming that, you know? So it kind of even further troubles that where the authorship lies.
I don't have an Instagram account, so I couldn't look in any great detail at the Equiano stories, but I got the gist of some of it, I think, from the ones I was able to preview in the grids and the description. And I was also interested in the implicitly invisible camera. So even when the format of the image strongly suggests a selfie, the overall logic of the project as a film, and in particular as something which is at least some kind of attempt at history, presupposes that the camera is invisible, right? If the camera, if the smartphone is there in those scenes, then those scenes aren't, they're not the scenes that there'll be something else, you know. They'd be out of joint historically. And that made me think about the classroom a fair bit as well, because as I said, I can't look at this content in any great detail, but I am really committed to close reading. And when I teach an upper level undergraduate class called Literature and Media, in which students very often write about Instagram, their own use of, or in a more detached way. And what I really strongly encourage them to do is to think about how close reading encompasses the entirety of the interface. So they can't just close read images, but have to close read images along with metrics and other affordances and features of the interface. And that, I think, is another way of getting at the shift in techniques. Thinking about the question, which I was really interested in, you know, if, as we've already said, the interesting narrative is really preoccupied with techniques, cultural techniques and technologies, technologies of writing, technologies of enslavement, technologies of the distinction and the overcoming of the distinction between the slave and the free person, then in what sense is that fascination with techniques and technologies remediated in Equiano stories? Is it at all? My sense is that it's kind of disappeared, or it disappears into kind of the meta level of the interface. And that introduces a different set of questions about how close reading across the two would work. And maybe the kind of presupposed invisibility of the smartphone in those sequences is one kind of arrow pointing towards some of that.
And like very unironically asking in the subtitle, I think, what does it look like, or what would it have looked like if an African boy had access to da da da, and not again considering the material and global relations that the digital world has with regard to Africa, and in terms of labor, the mining. I get it's a creative project, but I guess it that's how Equiano, I would imagine, would creatively engage with a question of this kind. Um, and I feel like it would be a great moment to use in a classroom setup to just think about both of these things simultaneously, because the smartphone is kind of present, but Equiano rarely talks about it in Equiano stories. But we know he talks about different kinds of techniques in the slave narrative, where he talks about the entire process of how he learned how to read. And there's this contingent kind of allyship with white women there, who help him learn how to read. And there's some of those questions that come up as well, which Equiano Stories does not give space to. And that was how I was thinking about Shruti's question about the pedagogical use of some of these modern adaptations, or just shows like Bridgerton. Yeah, I don't know if you were thinking in this particular direction, or
I mean, one of the things that our conversation prompted me to do was go to Equiano, the text, and just like kind of sift through my notes when we're talking about this, and especially with close reading. I've been thinking about how a lot of these texts are also ways in which we think about literary cultural forms and genres and subgenres and that kind of stuff, right? So I was just flipping through this to look at some things that Equiano is doing, and I came to a place where I think this is when the ship is I think he says it's August 1759, and we sail for Gibraltar, and like there's this huge fight that happens on the ship, and he's really scared. He thinks he's going to die. And he says, at the end of all of this, he's telling us his motivations and how he survived, because that's kind of like the trajectory of how he writes every section. There's like all of this drama, and then he tells us what motivated him to survive, right? So in this part, he says, I instantly cast off all fear or thought of whatever death, and went through the whole of my duty with alacrity, pleasing myself with the hope that if I survive the battle, of relating it and dangers I had escaped to the Miss Gurins and others when I should return to London. So he says that his survival is motivated by the need to narrate what he has survived. This motivation of narration is flipped on its head when it comes to an African boy who has a phone. And this change in literary form or cultural form is also so much more interesting, because Equiano is contributing to the formation of the slave narrative as a form of writing, as opposed to Equiano stories, where the subject is fitting into an already existing and proliferated form of engaging with the world. So here, Equiano wants to relate his story to these people. And of course, white women come into that in that particular conversation as well. And relatability and relating takes on a whole different meaning, and different affordances when it comes to a space like Instagram. Yeah, so that's kind of also what the digital is doing specifically here, with forms and with the kind of close reading that Sabi are talking about, looking at the smaller parts in the larger context of things. Yeah.
Right. There's a shift to a kind of confected real-time representation, like things being represented, the representation being produced at the same time that the things are happening. Whereas in Gates's reading of The Interesting Narrative, which is in a later chapter of The Signifying Monkey to the ones that we read, he's really emphasizing the double voicing in The Interesting Narrative, that Equiano he's narrating his experiences of things earlier in his life, and he's reflecting or analyzing those things with the experience of a much larger chunk of his life. So he's kind of he's narrating things, or his innocent, I guess, experience of things that were happening to him for the first time when he was younger, and analyzing them from the perspective of the point in his life at which he's writing. So there's a kind of double timing, or doubled temporality which is just completely flattened, or at least we have to look elsewhere for that kind of complicated or double temporality in the Instagram Equiano stories, which are just insisting on this kind of fake immediacy or fake real-time depiction, which is of course the fantasy that Instagram operationalizes, right? That you're producing and circulating images at the same time.
Yeah. It's so funny because like I think that's how people have engaged with it on Instagram. I was looking at the comments that people have left there, and one of the comments is I think from someone who has not read the narrative or does not quite know the form of the slave narrative as well. One of the questions is, does he ever go back to his village? Does he ever actually get to see his sister again? That's like one of the comments, and it's not ironic. That's like a really different engagement with Equiano there.
Yeah, right. And so yeah, the comments must be regarded as like a part of the object for analysis, right? For these reasons, because the comments are often telling us something about the way in which the aesthetic form works, at the same time that they're becoming part of the overall aesthetic object that you're apprehending.
Well, I'm
Right.
just interjecting here to see if you want to have another question, or if you're at time, I can.
Yeah, I know we're running out of time, but I quickly want to see if Zach, you would be willing to talk about your question about aesthetics and mediation, because that's kind of where we are. And maybe just thinking of larger questions at this conversation, it's been really fulfilling, this conversation, but I'm also left with so many questions to think about. So if we want to have a sentence or two about what, Zach, you were thinking about that question, and also just generally where we see some of these conversations going in the future.
Yeah, so I was thinking about two texts resonating together. Joseph Vogel's writing on Galileo's telescope, and Fred Moten's writing on black topological existence. In the telescope article, Vogel talks about the mediation that happens with the telescope to suddenly be able to see the stars, the cosmos, and how that instantiates the Copernican turn, because it not only relates to the stars, but also resituates the viewer. So you have this viewing lens and the viewer gets resituated. And then I was thinking about in Moten that he also draws on the Copernican turn, and thinking about in relation to that foundation, it shifted the entire foundations of a paradigm, and that in a world built on anti-blackness, that a reconsidered blackness would also require that. So, and he asks in that, when thinking about Arthur Jafa's work, how to think about blackness in a way that avoids the white gaze. And as we've been kind of talking about with these projects and how they're appropriated and things like that, I just wanted to ask how we can think about Equiano's image as an anesthetic mediation. Is that which is outside the archaeology or outside of the media presentation? Like, what does that look like at large?
I think I'd like to maybe, because we're wrapping up, come at this question from a slightly oblique angle, which has to do with triangulating Equiano's narrative and its reception with another system of communication, I guess, centered on, and to a large extent coming out of the institution of chattel slavery, which is described in a text that I circulated for this conversation, which is Julia Scott's The Common Wind. So in that book, Scott writes a history from below that emphasizes the communicational strategies of maroons and freed slaves and other kind of runaway or renegade figures in the Caribbean, which were communicational strategies which were often parasitic on, say, shipping routes. So people that were trying, in Scott's words, to find a masterless existence would often, as Equiano did, take jobs aboard boats, because those boats both made possible a mode of sociality which was often strictly prohibited by, say, slave codes on the Caribbean islands, but also made possible the circulation of knowledge, revolutionary sentiments and revolutionary energies, and made possible the planning eventually of slave revolts. And it seems to me that that's a really helpful way of thinking about communication and slavery with Equiano, because it's a mode of communication that's not directed at the production of an object that can circulate. So as you're reading Equiano's narrative, you're also reading the production of this narrative, which is heavily aestheticized. And as you said, it's constantly working through the acquisition of the techniques needed to produce the object that is the narrative. Whereas in Scott's account, we see these communicational strategies which seem largely to be, if not attempts to escape from, then at least are completely indifferent to the liberal form of subjectivity that's exemplified by the author figure, the figure that Equiano has to occupy as abolitionist and as writer. This connects us back to the fantasy of the Equiano cable as well. And so putting that in the mix, I think, is maybe hopefully helpful for thinking about these questions of mediation and aestheticization. What are the communicational strategies of the enslaved that aren't directed at the production of a stable aesthetic object, like the interesting narrative? Scott's Common Wind, I think, is a brilliant account of some of those strategies, and there are others elsewhere as well.
Rowan, would you want to quickly respond to that? Cut out that awkward silence in between.
Yeah. Oh, I found that so interesting, and also kind of a more liberating idea, because it's also, I feel like I was thinking a bit about like the different modes of, like, or just the semantics of capture across time, and that now being a term that applies to your movements online that are datafied or whatever, which is obviously like a kind of pathetic comparison with capturing a slave, but also kind of interesting to think about that Equiano's like that, or just the modes of resistance that you were just describing, Seb, are not necessarily about like evading capture or transcending capture or whatever, but kind of introducing almost like noise into the channels, or like noise being that which isn't quite like picked up, like an underground of communication. And I guess that gets back to your trickster question too, Kaushik, like how can we mobilize like kind of Equiano's trickster techniques online. And I just I think so often we're shooting for this transcendent kind of act or object of resistance that would fully kind of liberate the digital sphere or whatever, which I think is actually kind of a narrative of digital power, and of very much embodied in that cable, that like this cable is in bearing the name Equiano, and going from Europe to Africa is kind of like bringing a transcendent freedom or something. So I don't know, I think that's interesting to experiment with, that space of noise and anesthesia, I guess, that is not, maybe is captured to some extent, but something exceeds or goes unnoticed in there.
Yeah, this has really been super productive, Rowan, what you said and what all of you said. It's made me feel like I will think more about Equiano than I already have been thinking, especially because I'm invested in the 18th century so much, and the persistence of the 18th century in our world, and Equiano seems to be a crucial figure that brings all of that together for us in the self-fashioning that he draws attention to consciously when he's doing that. Yeah, this is wonderful.
It's unfortunate that we have to finish this conversation, but it's been so exciting. I'm really, really thankful to all of you for just agreeing to think together and doing this strange format. And I mean, I had some sense of where we'd go, but then this has just been beyond what I had imagined, just how rich and wonderful the conversation has been. So thank you all so much.
Thank you
Yes,
so much
thank
for the
you.
invitation. I'm very
Yeah.
excited to be
Yeah.
part of it.
Yeah,
thank you.
same. And it's like nice to meet you all. It's been a
Yeah,
pleasure.
Likewise.
I feel you've opened up the space to have at least another seminar on this.
Totally.
But thank you so much, everybody, and it's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.